Welcome to the 2016 Henry Louis Gates Jr. Annual Lecture. My name is Jacqueline Goldsby, and I'm Professor of English and Chair of Yale's African American Studies Department. And on behalf of our faculty, students, and staff, I'm so happy to see all of you here, and thank you for making the time to come. The Gates Lecture marks the capstone of African American Studies academic year, not simply because the event literally closes out our year of public programming. The Gates Lectures are a particular and special occasion for our department because these talks give us a chance to think incisively and collectively with the entire Yale community about the largest issues and most decisive developments that shape our fields of inquiry. Now 4 years old, this series has brought world-leading scholars in Black diaspora studies to Yale. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, the dramatist, poet, critic, and Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, the legal theorist Patricia James J. Williams, and today, Black feminist theorist and literary critic Hortense J. Spillers. They all come to share with us their newest original work. And in this way, we honor the example of the scholar after whom the series is named, Henry Louis Gates Jr., whose pioneering literary criticism, theory, and archival recovery projects have been, like our lecturer's scholarship, foundational to African American and Black diaspora studies, and indeed liberal arts inquiry as such. To organize an event like this requires a communal effort, and I want to give thanks to the Yale staff, colleagues, and units that have made today possible. In African American studies, our awesome staff, all of them, Jody Stewart-Moore, Edith Rothkopf, and especially Lisa Monroe and Jeanette Sullivan. They deserve an awful large round of applause. For all of the work they've done over these months to get us here today. Thank you so much. In the provost's office, Deputy Provost Emily Bakemeyer made sure that we were threading the needles and dotting the I's and crossing the T's on our budget to make all of those dots connect, and I want to thank her for her help and advice. And I also want to thank Diane Whitty of the university's development office, who's been very generous and supportive of our work to pull this event together and to make it what we hope will be a special day for us all. Thank you, Diane. And I also want to thank the University Library for letting us use this wonderful space here in Sterling Memorial Library. It's fitting to have this lecture here this time, given the thanks that we owe the lecture series' main supporter, Daniel and Joanna Rose. The Roses created the endowment that funds the Gates Lecture Series, and I want to say to you how honored we are that you've chosen to support the work and the vision that we carry for African American studies at Yale to this scale. Thank you so very much for your support. And part of the reason why in this particular instance it's fitting that we're here at Sterling and Mr. Rose is here with us is that I want to acknowledge his family's long-held commitment to education. Not only here at Yale, the family supports the Yale Library's Fortunoff Holocaust Survivors Video Archive, Rose Walk, the passageway, the plaza that we all crossed over to get into this building. The Roses are also supportive of educational initiatives in the place they call home, New York City. Most notably, Mr. Rose founded and is chairman emeritus of the highly acclaimed Harlem Educational Activities Fund, whose Black and Latino students are flowing into the leading colleges and universities across the US. And I want to thank you for that kind of activism on behalf of the work we do here at Yale African American Studies. So another round of applause for you. And now to introduce today's distinguished lecturer. Hortense J. Spillers is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. She received her PhD in English and American Literature from Brandeis University, writing what was in 1974 a path-breaking project, Fabrics of History, Essays on the Black Sermon. Over the course of her career, she has taught at Wellesley College, Haverford College, the University of Nebraska, which must have taken special fortitude, Emory University, the Free University in Berlin, Cornell University, and now Vanderbilt. She has authored and edited 3 books that are now foundational texts in the fields of African American studies, and Black feminist literary studies. Conjuring, Black Women, Fiction and Literary Tradition, co-edited with Marjorie Price, published by Indiana University Press. Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in the Modern Text, selected papers from the English Institute, published by Routledge. And Black and White in Color, Essays on American Literature and Culture, published by the University of Chicago Press. This last work, Black and White in Color, demonstrates Spillers' intellectual powers in their richest light, not simply because the essays encompass a staggering range of literary interests and theoretical fluencies. In my view, this book commands attention because with it, Spillers issues an astounding argument for her particular talent, the art of the essay. To explain why, I want to hone in on a particular passage in the book's introduction, Peter's Pans, on eating in the diaspora, an essay that we actually discussed in a lunchtime seminar in the department today. Here, Spillers sharpens the manifest theme of this particular essay, how food and foodways can be studied semiotically as a cultural trope of the African diaspora history and critical race studies. While a remarkable line of inquiry in and of itself, what's striking to me is how Spillers subtly discloses the hermeneutics of her own prose style. Substitute the essay for cuisine and food in the following passage, and Spillers' ingenuity as a theorist comes shining forth. With food, we are both at home and abroad, a product of a particular urban block or a spot of provincial countryside, and a worldling of multi-languages and cultures. I see no need to choose. As a material relations and practice that enter economies, institutions, and elementary bodies, that cross spaces, borders, and defenses, that permeate differences, similarities, and commonalities, that show the intransigence of certain cultural values, at the same time that they exemplify porosity and change, the arts of the cuisine offer a central metaphor for the contact zone and our pluralist possibilities. The joining place of bread and bread, the feast that moves but can also be still, food always breeds a politics, a history, bears publicness as well as intimacy and representability, is visible, yet the stuff whose biochemistry, like growing life, remains somehow mysterious, and in the translation makes a body glow and glow. In the cuisine, contradiction comes home and is not unhappy. Indeed, the hallmark of the Spillers essay is that contradiction comes home and is not unhappy. If by contradiction we're referring to the ways in which the essay mode allows Spillers to enter economies and institutions that cross spaces, borders, and defenses that show the intransigence of certain cultural values at the same time that they exemplify porosity and change. The malleability of the essay forms enriches Spillers' style of argument because the genre's capaciousness lets her explore the full range of her subject's boundaries. Spillers can be at home and abroad in this mode, since with the essay, she can say yes and no at once to her own propositions, thus grounding her queries in finely honed analytic foundations. This is the case in the essay, All the Things You Could Be by Now If Sigmund Freud's Wife Was Your Mother. She also has a particular talent at coming up with titles. Here, Spillers' admittedly divided stance both for and against classical psychoanalysis as a proper paradigm to historicize racial trauma leads to a revitalized method for interpreting the dreamscapes of Black people and their life worlds. There is, of course, her remarkable intervention with Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book. This 1987 essay, which has to be one of the most cited and generative works in all of Black feminist theory, proposed nothing less than to reconceive the historiography of slavery, shifting critical attention away from the over-known claims detailing the operations of racism's political economy to the regime's then less explained functions as a system of gender domination. Spillers weaves the stunning analysis borrowing from Marx and Freud's theories of identity formation and the fetish to argue how the peculiar institution deformed the very idea of gender as an organizing condition of the enslaved's chattel status. A tour de force of argument, this essay stands with the works of Winthrop Jordan, Eugene Genovese, and Orlando Patterson because it situates gender at the nexus where the social death caused by slavery occurs. As these three examples suggest, Spillers' intellectual creativity and archive of learning are astonishing. In the world as she interprets it, Edmund Morgan and Slavoj Žižek shed compatible light on the history and meaning of slavery. Multilingual, Spillers herself recovers and translates obscure French language clinical studies of Senegalese youth to test the capacities of Freud's Oedipal theories in her essays on psychoanalysis. At home in the varieties of experienced literary critics call modernism, Spillers readily and ably links the aesthetics of Jean Toomer and William Faulkner, T.S. Eliot and Gwendolyn Brooks, Ralph Ellison and Kenneth Burke, Alice Walker and Sigmund Freud, Toni Morrison and Mikhail Bakhtin, Paul Marshall and Emanuel Wallerstein. A prize-winning poet, and this is a line hidden on your CV, she's also a radio DJ. And you'll hear this in her voice. Early on in her career, Spillers comes to language and to literature, to history and art with a special ear, one that allows her to discern unexpected affinities within and across the life worlds that Black people inhabit with others and create for themselves. I expect we'll explore these ideas in the lecture she'll deliver today, Shades of Intimacy, What the 18th Century Teaches Us. Please join me in welcoming our 2016 Gates Lecturer, Professor Hortense Spillers, to Yale.
Oh my goodness, what an introduction. I want to thank Jackie Goldsby for that fabulous introduction and for making this day possible by extending this invitation to me to be here today. It's a great pleasure to see you. I also want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Rose for their generosity that makes this occasion possible. And thank you for being here today. I know there are a number of other places where you could have been, but you chose to be here, and I really appreciate it. It's probably been 10 years since I've been on your beautiful campus. I hadn't seen the study before. I think that's new. It's the only hotel that I have ever been in that has a desk in it that works, so that whoever designed that hotel is really brilliant. They have a very good sense of what human beings are like, and that a desk really should operate as a desk. That's terrific. I think the last time I was here, Calvin Warren was a graduate student here. Before that, Sadia Hartman was a student in the audience, right? So I've been here on a few occasions. It's great to be here to see you today. I'm getting over a little bronchial thing. Jackie did not tell me that it was still cold in New Haven. It's quite hot in Nashville, Tennessee, so I didn't necessarily come dressed for late winter. So if I tend to break up in a fit of coughing, I will try to recover by having a little water. I want to talk today out of really what is a series of notes on a subject that I have been working on for a while now, that really is nowhere near a conclusion. And as you know, it takes me a long time to get things worked out. Shades of Intimacy. is what I'm calling this project. And it gives its name to aspects on a problematic, really with no end in sight, and that is huge. And that is to say, what is the status of women in the circumstances of revolution in Europe, or specifically the emergence or the birth of the modern French state, and then two sites in the Americas, in the Caribbean, the French Antilles and Saint-Domingue, en route to Haiti, which is our first modern black republic, and the British colonies of North America on the trajectory of what becomes the United States. The 18th century bears special markings for us, as these three sites are exemplary because I believe that they demonstrate with occasional clarity, if we can read the signs, and I'm still trying to learn to read the signs, what is at stake in the emergence of a subject that we call today African diasporic, or a subject who is interstitial to African and New World cultural forms. Ira Berlin suggests that the location of this subject in the netherworld of coastal sub-Saharan West Africa, those trading castles along the West African coast, yields a prototypical hyphenated African subject. I would call it an interstitial subject who appears to belong to the 18th century in particular because his presence, her presence, expresses the paradox or makes the paradox appear of the world that claims it wants freedom yet tolerates slavery in at least a third of it. This is the era of the problem of slavery in the Western world, as David Ryan Davis and other investigators have defined it. What does it mean to be human is evoked with special acuity during the time of revolution because the question entails a historical apprenticeship that is not limited to black personality, but draws humanity in its toils precisely because what has counted as human is suddenly transformed by the collapse of order and degree. If sovereignty, for example, comes to ambiguously reside in a representative symbolic figure as the idea of democracy is strengthened, then its reverberations will be felt throughout the socio-political order. But more than that, the contradictions born of the simultaneity of slavery and freedom, of the absolute interpenetration of one and the other, are startling in their apparently universal significance. This weave of relations is partially shrouded by the public world of profit and production, just as it disappears into the shadowy remoteness of the private world with its masks of affection, sentimentality, and cruelty. The one word that seems to cross this ambiguous and ambivalent territory of public and private, light and shade, production and reproduction could be intimacy that registers the confusion precisely because it is, in this instance, neither fish nor fowl. What do we call the children born of sexual congress between enslaved and their owners, more precisely, the liaison between the enslaved and their owners. Douglass, in his 1845 narrative, observes what he regards as a new social fact on the ground of coercive labor, and that is the sexual work engendered in this calculus of relations has produced what Douglass calls the new people, although such children have appeared in Virginia colony even before the 18th century. In the story that Berlin tells about communities that spring up along the African littoral, Douglass draws out this strand of sociality because he wants to emphasize the utter corruption of slavery's protocols, masters who own their children. As such a subject himself, Douglass was keenly aware of the contradictions of his status, that what we call mixed race today, mixed race standing did not guarantee freedom even as it enhanced the owner's profits. An investigator is struck by the epiphenomenon of the new people, not only because of figures like Frederick Douglass and Sally Hemings, who was the daughter and mother of interracial crossing, but also as these particulars lead us to a broader inquiry about intimate life in a world that allows, indeed enables, both family in its juridical privilege and personality, and extra familial life as the secret heart of the family's other. The stuff of novels and film, as for example, William Wells Brown's Clotel or The President's Daughter, will attest. This familial parallelism, the family and the shadow family, is not an exception to the rule. As a matter of fact, I'm beginning to think that it might have been the rule of slavery, that it was not at all exceptional. I think when that fact was borne in on me, actually not so long ago, it was quite stunning that when we talk about morganatic marriages and concubinage relationships, we're talking about something that is quite common. So it's not at all an exception to the rule, and if it's not dominant, and I think I may be on the verge of saying that it is at least a substantial arrangement of slavery's generations across the color line. So what I hope to do eventually is to extract from the record a redefined and refined sense of intimacy in a circumstance where flesh becomes the medium of exchange, because I am convinced that even the master family was not exempt from the brutalities of slavery, that they actually occur on the ground of slavery, if not fisticuffs and binding, certainly its psychological cruelties. And I think that's the question that I'm eventually trying to ask, how the enslavement of African persons was actually a social economy that affected everybody that was involved in the system, so that in fact one wonders what we do with the topic of love under those circumstances. So the problematic that I am attempting to isolate in this project is how to name what happens at a depth in the century of revolution. We have a fairly good sense of the spatio-temporal sweep of the revolutionary arc, but what I'm searching for tends to evade the archives, to disappear into the world of the everyday. If the shadow families of the master class, were defined by their economic relations to the master, then how did this intrusion of money matters reconfigure the whole range of structures of feeling, of official intimate relations between husbands and wives, of the sibling relationship? In looking at this material, we are confronted by what I would call two genres of historiography. I would call Annette Gordon Reed's work on the Hemingses of Monticello, for example, and I'm sure many people here are familiar with that very substantial work. It is a prominent instance of what I would call a positive assertion. In the triad of texts that she has produced so far, and I just saw the last one, which is a study of Jefferson that just recently came out. In that triad of texts that she has produced so far on Sally Hemings's liaison with Thomas Jefferson, the overall narrative that she advances pursues the tropological fortunes of what Toni Morrison has referred to as the American romance of race. In this instance, Hemings and her relatives are given protective cover and a proximity to Jefferson and his family that spares them the more brutal realities of enslavement. This mode of historiography resembles a kind of fictional writing, as in the case of Barbara Chase Riboud's Hemings novels, and as far as I can tell, she wrote two of them a couple of decades ago, that posits the seeds of intimacy between master and enslaved. In other words, the enslaved, in this view of things, is constituted more or less as a sexual object of desire, so that what we understand as love and intimacy are not only possible between master and enslaved, but it is even likely. If you look at Riboud's novel on the character of Sally Hemings is in love with the character of Thomas Jefferson, and so on. The question I would raise about that is, what is our investment in having the story turn out that way? What is our investment in that particular trope or that tropological procedure? In the antithetical instance, the historiographical narrative paints a very different picture that projects a negative assertion. For example, in a study of intimacy in the antebellum South, Stephen Stowe argues that even the most persistent and intimate contact between masters and the bonded, as in the case of enslaved figures who, like the Hemingses, worked as domestic servants in the household of masters, did not yield intimacy between parties. As Stephen Stowe describes it, intimacy in the antebellum South was aligned with public forms and perception, as expressed in rituals of courtship. Such rituals assured the acknowledgement of an intimate relations unfolding so that the ritual form became a kind of knowledge or epistemology distributed among members of a class, which bespeaks a sharing of values. So this very private thing in our world, between and among lovers, which we relegate in the shareable imaginary to the private and domestic sphere, if those terms still work. I'm not sure they do. But in any case, those lovers in Stowe's conceptual narrative are assigned to the world of public forms and performance. Why does the difference matter? Or how does the difference matter? If close proximity or constant contact does not guarantee intimacy in this social order, then it seems to me that our notions of intimacy and shades of intimacy are thrown into crisis. I would have to admit that this question gets sharper for me as time passes, and a 20th century cinematic instance drove home to me a little bit more of what I was trying to get at. I'm sure that a lot of people here saw 12 Years a Slave, right? And read the narrative, 12 Years a Slave. It actually took me 2 years to get to the movie. I had read the narrative some time ago and recognized that it was not just discovered by somebody in Britain just a few years ago. I mean, I've known that story for a very long time. But I was afraid to go to see what I actually had to see in the movie. You will recall the juxtaposition of two scenes, right? And this is the work of film editing, of course. But then we also imagine that maybe something like that actually happened quite a lot in real life. The scene where one of the protagonists is beaten takes place the night after the master has been in the person's bed, right? So this is what I'm talking about when I ask the question about what intimacy or close proximity promises or guarantees in the social order, and in this case, it seems to me that it guarantees nothing. Okay. So if proximity is not reliable as a measure of social cohesion, if sexual partners and their children can be sold off, if shadow families can assert no claims to the human dignity of official families, then sentimentality and feelings of love can be shown to be unstable, I believe, everywhere. Did slavery across the Western world rupture ties of kinship and filiation so completely that the 18th century, and possibly earlier, demolishes what Constance Classen, in the deepest sense, a cultural history of touch, calls a tactile cosmology? When in an earlier piece of writing I sought a distinction between body and flesh, I was attempting to isolate features of citizen belonging from alien bodies and entities. I would associate bodiedness with juridical personality or the historical actor or agent who has access to what our 14th Amendment calls due process. Under its impress, at least in theory, other rights-bearing follows. Flesh describes an alien entity, a more or less expendable figure. Not only does the alien, who can be an alien in some ways arbitrarily, by race or language or culture and custom, not only does the alien not have access to the protocols of due process, but perhaps its most poignant determination is the extent to which such a body cannot prevent or ward off another's touch. So for me, the single most powerful evidence of the loss of freedom is the fact that bodies lose their integrity and may be invaded or entered, so to speak, by coercive power. This touch that we associate with intimacy can, under the right conditions, engender invasion and violence, and in its immediacy, in relationship to the enslaved, robs the haptic of its powers to heal, to bind, to cure, and becomes instead the power to wound and violate. Here's another note from Klassen, quote, "In the sensory scale of races created by the natural historian Lawrence Oken, the civilized European I-man who focused on the visual world was positioned at the top, and the African skin man who used touch as his primary sensory modality at the bottom." I am suggesting that under slavery's regimes, the captive body's susceptibility to being touched or manhandled places this body on the side of the flesh, so that touching here is not a token of social cohesion, as Klassen describes it in the period preceding the modern age, of brotherhood or fellowship or fellow feeling, but rather the very breadth and depth of alienation, among other things, from the laws, and perhaps even ways of distinguishing human life from bear life or animal life, so that I have begun to wonder what the touchability of the enslaved had to do with the kind of public relations that followed those populations, right? I mean, what kind of stories were circulated about that humanity that was subject to touch, even from strangers. The leading descriptive features of slavery's eras tend to be economic, as we know, in the most pointed sense of the term. Balance sheets and accounting procedures, gains, losses, profit margins in the flow of goods, while our most sustained focus on the institution and its practices come to rest on what Pierre Bourdieu might have called a general science of the economy of practices. In other words, the argument that is based on narrow economic considerations defines the enslaved as a species of property. By contrast, the argument that seeks to mobilize an understanding of the position of the enslaved and of the world that unmakes him or her as a culminative instance of a general science of an economy of practices attempts to grasp the circumstance of the bonded as a type of historical subjectivity. In both the species of property and a type of historical subjectivity, we recognize in their very naming the ambivalence of status that would prohibit either from standing in as a pure or legible example of property or a purely unforeclosed instance of the subject of history which revolutionary movement seeks to create. Neither embodies the paradigmatic norm from which deviation might be gauged. The enslaved, then, is already a category mistake whose subject begins his, her human odyssey in paradox as a mark or an inscription of the paradoxical dilemma that exposes irreconcilable or incommensurate postures. We might think of slavery then for the enslaved as a series of gaps or aporias of which even the slaveholder himself is aware, generating parallel contradictions given his utter dread that definitive police power, an extension of his own dominance, and the force of law are not enough. The fascinating spectacle of moral and political jujitsu that colonial power dances around the dilemma of the enslaved. For instance, Jefferson's splitting of the difference between the simultaneously held beliefs in gradual emancipation and Black repatriation, or the long train of abolitionist thinkers who embrace the principle of emancipation, yet believe at the same time that the African is far less human and socializable than others, or yet, across the revolutionary terrain, the colonialists' rhetorical appropriation of the discourses of liberation in their own behalf, while denying the legitimate human claims of the enslaved, all reflect the tensions unleashed by the African's ontological status as the confounding of human and proprietary aims and identities. Mixed race or mulatto-ness belongs to this calculus of contradictions. The available racial ascriptions of Jefferson's and Hemings's world are as inadequate and flawed as the concept of race itself, interstitial to the allegedly fixed postures of Black and white. The mulatto is consigned to a liminal space that is dragged along, at least in the U.S. instance, as an unresolved figure of slavery's closure, although, as we've already noted, one's being neither nor does not save her from the arbitrary and whimsical reflexes of power that define the behavior of the master class. Sally Hemings, in the particular instance, embodies a supplementary dilemma insofar as her supposed erotic relationship to the empowered, or erotic in the American romance of race, and erotic is a troublesome term here, positions her within the precincts of sentiment, as sentimentality plays out among the Hemingses. 2 generations of children born to enslaved women carried the mother's last name. This defining children by the name and status of the mother is instrumental to the overriding significance of property rights and the laws of inheritance. Though erotically involved with power, and herself the product of such an engagement, Sally Hemings was not manumitted by her famous owner during his lifetime, but her children would be. Annette Gordon-Reed notes that only a handful of Jefferson's considerable population of enslaved peoples, hundreds of people, I think maybe something like 500 or 600, some historians have said that only a handful of members of this population was let go before his death, and that all of these were Hemingses. It could be said then that the social distance that we perceive between Black and white made the location of the color line strikingly clear, while the mulatto figure falling athwart the difference sustains no legally defined social identity. Sally Hemings is roughly analogous to women of the master class. Quite specifically, this does not mean all white women. Rather, it defines precisely women of the master class, insofar as she, like they, following Amy Drew Stanley's analysis, remained within households bound together by ties of affection, though admittedly we cannot be sure about the affection piece. If white women who embodied the concept of sex difference gained no individual entitlements in relationship to contract theory and practice, which came to take the place of relations of dominance and subservience, then their deficiency of juridical personality was predicated on the fact that they were, quote, part of the family. Protected by neither the heroics of masculinity as black men would be in gaining the franchise nearly a century later, nor the prerogatives of sentimentality as women of the master class would be, African women of the Republican era fall outside the disposable subject positions as interstitial Sally Hemings, but for different reasons, that the documents of the era make available. The Haitian Constitution of 1805 offers an interesting contrast. Their lack of juridically defined personality, except in negative cases, exposes the fundamental lability, or lability is the word I want, and I guess liability as well, and changeability of free and enslaved. In other words, what comes to be reified as natural to the identity of white males turns out to be the subject of risk and negotiation in other cases. In effect, black women, customarily and emphatically not Sally Hemings, as fiction and historiography imagine her, can only broach the territory of the human as members of a race, just as their brethren, and their entire historical apprenticeship as a result is contextualized on the muddy ground that falls between sex, gender distinctions on the one hand and race difference on the other, between the private realm and the erotic on the one hand, that depends on sex gender difference, and the public realm and the historical on the other that is predicated on race difference. The equality that is evoked in the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and the constitutions of Haiti, the 1802 and 1805 constitutions, all emanate from the notion of the self-willing, self-owning one, whose interest in property is now a matter of law. Another like himself is neither more nor less than he, as access to markets and money and the law arbitrate between and among legal personalities. Amy Drew Stanley, in the work From Bondage to Contract, provides a link between changing attitudes about labor, sentiments about freedom and equality, and the blossoming movement of emancipation that is tied to the revolutionary ideal. Transitory and fleeting, the contractual relationship did not extend beyond its reason for being, and for some observers, the world of contract is solidly set over and against the sentimental realm, or the realm of feeling. belonging to the sphere of private and personal relations. Sentiment is opposed to contract and comes to describe women's sphere and its grammars of feeling, including sexual and erotic gestures that mark it off from the public world of action over things, the sphere of the Jewish Prudential. As the slavery debate intensifies and proceeds through the decades that lead up to the Civil War, contract theory plays a crucial role in configuring conceptualizations engendered by the abolitionist campaigns. Stanley even goes so far as to contend that contract became the language of insurgent popular politics, and that much of the force of its appeal was adopted from African women's New World experience. And two key principles obtain here. One of them is that slavery denies contractual ability. That's a part of the due process in the enslaved, but even before that, the slave is divested of self-ownership, those haphazards of the haptic that I was talking about a moment ago, divested of self-ownership and therefore must suffer the convoy of evils that follows in the wake of such deficiency. The experience of slave women under slavery's regimes advances the notion of a double threat insofar as they were vulnerable to sexual torture and abuse, as well as the repertory of normative discipline and punishment that attaches to the travails of violently coerced labor. Not that the male did not endure the same regimes, but I would argue that the rights of the master of the household placed women in power's orbit in systematically provocative ways. The sexual abuse and use of black women in slavery was the rule. Hemings' mother, for instance, birthed some 12 children, maybe more, half of them children with the black father, the other half children with the white father. So, trapped in immanence and the life of the species, these females essentially repeat animal life with no horizon beyond it. This motif is scored into the fabric of everyday life for bonded women, and under the circumstance, it was neither shocking nor unexpected to the coeval world that they would have been so. Stanley contends that the flesh of female slaves thus took center stage in abolitionist propaganda. We recall that it is the scourged body of the bonded woman that we most vividly remember, as does Douglass himself from the latter's 1845 narrative and the powerful tale of flight in the avoidance of sexual persecution that animates the long and torturous journey of Harriet Jacobs. In accounts tinged with eroticism, Drew Stanley argues, abolitionists across the race divide evoked a corporeal slave economy that was diametrically opposed to the sexual order of free society, in which female purity, as Harriet Jacobs pleads her case, was valued as a priceless possession. In short, bondswomen subjected to the tortures of the flesh in the discipline of the sexual and laboring body become the quintessential image of the terrors of the peculiar institution. Under such conditions, it seems that the erotic and the sexual are meaningless, except that we recognize them by their absence. Not protected by the ties of sentiment, which could be interrupted for any reason, often narrowly economic, as we've pointed out, the enslaved confronted in her person what living was in the absence of love and sex beyond naked copulation. Not only this, but the very withdrawal of private and privacy as a human right, at the same time that the bonded woman belonged to public history only insofar as she was the ambiguous subject owned like things by others. What our writers and historians have paid imaginative witness to is the fact that there is no human loneliness and aloneness remotely comparable to that of the enslaved, beyond the reach and scope of love and freedom, beyond touch that is a token of care, of concernful care. The day that the enslaved decides to act out the threat of death that always hangs over her by risking her life is the first day of wisdom, as Toni Morrison promises. And whether or not one survives it is perhaps less important than the recognition that unless one is free, love cannot and will not matter. Thank you.
Talk with the thing. So thank you, Dr. Spillers. Given the lovely introduction that we got from Professor Goldsby about the way in which you've innovated and revolutionized the form of the essay, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how the theories of intimacy that you challenge us with in this particular piece, how they're mobilized in a particular way in the form of the essay for you, or how you think about theories of intimacy and how you formalistically construct the essay. I don't know if I'm always struck by, and again, Professor Goldsby really laid it out so just gorgeously, what you're able to aesthetically as well as theoretically explore within your scholarship at the level of form as well as content. And so I guess in this particular piece, I'm interested in how you're thinking about intimacy as it formalistically works out in the piece. You know, I have ideas, but I'm interested in how your writing process and working through this very difficult revisitation of these issues that we continue to struggle with in our everyday work as Black feminists.
I was saying that this came up.
Should I give you mine?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, this came up at lunch today in the form of a question about the memoir as a place that some academic writing is going. And I was thinking about that in relationship to my own work, which in a way is always a memoir. I mean, it's always, my work is always inflected through something that I am paying close attention to in an intimate or personal way at the moment, so that from that point of view, I'm never really detached from the thing that I'm writing. And I think what I'm trying to do in writing is get the feeling on the page, right? I think I'm trying to show how a particular question really does have implications for me as a writer, which is what I suggest to my students all the time, that the stuff that we're reading and writing about is not something out there somewhere. It has something to do with us, with ourselves, right? There are implications for us in the work that we do, and so I think that's sort of.
No, thank you. I mean, I would add to that, for me as a listener, that I feel as though you so brilliantly and virtuosically stage a kind of presumptive epistemological intimacy that you then overturn in your work. I don't know if that, you know, so you so intricately are able to map out these constructs that seem so familiar to us and then turn them on their head. And I think at the level of formalistic detail, it's really powerful in terms of trying to stage a reimagining of how we think about history and historiography. So thank you once again.
You know, I always think that if we don't solve a problem, we're going to die. Mm-hmm. So
that's how it feels. That's how it feels listening to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for just another brilliant. Does this work? Okay. For another brilliant intervention. I mean, this is just, it's really amazing work. I've been thinking a lot, and part of the reason I wanted to come here today was I've been thinking a lot about the 18th century, and you've given me yet another way to think about the 18th century, which is extraordinarily fruitful. One of the, I guess there's so many things I want to say, but one that I want to ask is, I was reading recently about Harriet Martineau, and particularly this idea that she develops in the 19th century that in some ways the absence of public prostitution in the South especially gives rise to some of the kinds of violence and abuse precisely that you're talking about, that sort of easy access to slave women's bodies in the absence of a kind of, and for all kinds of reasons, religious, blah, 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 otherwise, but gives rise to a lot of the kind of violence that, of course, also then increases the slaveholders, since slaves follow the condition of the mother, literally increases also his economic bottom line. So I mean, in thinking through her and listening to you today, I wonder if there's anything you'd want to say in particular about this notion of a kind of absence of this idea of public prostitution and religiosity, because that's the one thing that I was expecting to hear from you a little bit today about religion, because there's all kinds of contradictions that introduces as well. But I wonder if you'd say a little bit more, or a little bit about how that also sort of works into this idea of these domestic affections that get disrupted in this way that you're talking about so beautifully.
Okay. So I'm dwelling on your last words, unless one is free, love cannot and will not matter. And so you began talking through the complete kind of interpenetration of slavery and freedom, so those ideas about freedom. So I guess what I'm asking then is sort of whose love is that? Like who's, if the free part of the first part of that statement, unless one is free, then love cannot and will not matter. Like is love also, how is that being constructed? And is that are you trying to sort of unsettle some construction of love that accompanied the construction of freedom? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making...
It does make sense.
If the one term is problematic and you're troubling a lot, then what does that mean for the other?
Yeah, I know. It's being helpless in view of the grammar. Right? That you can't say it. You can't say it any other way. When I say love, I guess I am applying the famous poet's definition of the erotic. I'm trying to think, who was it that talked about the woman poet, Lord? Yeah, who talked about touch in a very different way. So I'm talking about retrieving love so that it means something, I guess, humanized. I think that's what I meant in mind. And that sentence was really written in light of the romance of race that certain of the novels give us. It's an outright love story.
Or the histories?
And so what I'm saying there is that, that is not a credible conclusion under the conditions that we are describing. That it's not, it's either credible or comforting to know or to believe that masters love black women because they left their white wives to go down to the camp. That's not, there's nothing comforting about that story. And we have sometimes, or some observers have taken comfort in that as proof that there's some kind of love. And if love has to operate that way, then it seems to me that one needs to say, well, I don't need that. If that's what that is, I need something else. That's not it. And that's really what that sentence means, that, if the woman is a subject of lust, that's not proof of love. Why?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that because there was a statement you made earlier, and I'm going to botch this, I know, but something to the nature of if slavery can disrupt these bonds of affection in that context, then they can be disrupted in some ways in any context.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether that's a statement though about the nature, the volatile nature and vulnerable nature of love and of domestic affection, or is it a statement about the power of and the absolute ruthless nature of the power of the institution of slavery, or something in between? I guess that's the question I want to ask, and sort of in follow-up to what she was getting at too.
I think it's the latter, but then the question you asked about the volatile nature of love, I guess it could be that too. But what do you have an answer to that?
I was struck by it when you said it because because the thing that my mind immediately went to this idea of, because I'm having having taught a course a few years ago called Aspects of Love, where we essentially work to disabuse people of the notion of romantic love altogether. It certainly conjured up the idea of the very constructed nature of that category itself. That doesn't, get away from, I think, the very particular way in which you are clearly taking it up and its history and its utility in the culture, and its importance and its standing in the culture. But I guess I didn't quite understand whether you were coming from a place whether of this being a statement on the vulnerable nature of this thing, or whether this thing that is such a powerful ideology, if you will, in the culture itself is also subject to evisceration under this very extraordinary, peculiar institution.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the gynecologic object of desire that W. J. Cash speaks about in Line of Desire, right? The gynecology is created around the figure of the Southern Belle, right? And somehow that equals love, or that it has been equated grammatically and rhetorically with love. And I think I would want to disabuse oneself of that notion. I guess what I'm saying is that I wonder how love actually expresses itself in slavery forms, right? In such an order where they're missing. Because even in the absence of physical abuse, I'm thinking that the psychological domestic abuse must have been really very common in slavery. We have a relationship to the master class, the master. The women were really getting their heads handed and calling it something else, calling it white privilege or upper class. And it's like, I bet that's not true. If he does that to those people, where's the love for you? That's the picture that
Thank you for that lecture, a lot. But so one thing I learned, I think I learned, I'm going to check this with you. When I teach Plato's Gorgias, and he talks about the tyrant being a victim of their own injustice, and students find that very unintuitive, to say the least. Like, well, how does the tyrant suffer by being a tyrant? When Plato says the tyrant suffers, and I've never been able to explain that quite well, and I think you are. Am I wrong to think that you're giving an explanation like the master class is suffering? It's the social order that's created by tyranny, robs everyone, including the master class, of fundamental human goods. That's super cool.
That's like shades of intimacy. I mean, if the enslaved experiences social death, everybody's getting a little piece of something that's not a good thing. So that if you look at the social economy, the whole universe has to be out of order in a situation that tolerates that. So that's what I want. Without wanting to take anything away from the people physically suffering those daily negatives, not only taking anything away, but this other